Commander Velthok adjusted his 4 primary eye stalks with practiced irritation. 27 cycles of military service, and they still made him babysit the fresh meat. The newest batch of cadets stood in formation before him, a motley collection of species from across the Galactic Defense Coalition. Carthan shock troops with their ridiculous head crests, Milvani scouts who looked like walking sticks with attitude problems, and Zoran heavies who could probably punch through a battleship hull but couldn't tie their own boots without detailed instructions. And then there was the human. She stood at the far end of the formation, barely reaching the shoulder height of her nearest classmate. Petite, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and sporting the kind of innocent smile that made seasoned warriors want to wrap her in protective padding and send her home to safety. Her name was Maya Cross, according to the roster, and she had somehow managed to pass every preliminary test despite looking like she belonged in a nursery rather than a military academy. "Listen up, maggots," Velthok's voice echoed across the training compound, causing several smaller cadets to flinch. "Today you face the trial of fangs. Each of you will enter that arena." He gestured with 2 of his 6 arms toward the massive circular structure behind him, "and face our war beast, Grimjaw. The creature will test your courage, your reflexes, and your will to survive. Those who pass continue their training. Those who fail, well, let's just say our medical bay has excellent regeneration facilities." A nervous chuckle rippled through the group. Maya Cross, however, simply nodded politely as if he had just offered her tea and biscuits. Velthok continued his speech, but his attention kept drifting to the human. He had read her file. Naturally, Earth was still considered a backwater planet by most galactic standards, recently discovered and barely out of their own planetary conflicts. Their species was classified as moderately dangerous in close combat, with notable persistence traits and an alarming tendency towards self-sacrifice. Standard stuff, really. What wasn't standard was how she had aced every written examination, scored in the 95th percentile on tactical simulations, and somehow managed to out-endure a Carthan warrior during their infamous 20-hour survival challenge. The Carthan in question, a specimen called Thrak Nor, had actually collapsed from exhaustion, while Maya had cheerfully volunteered to continue for another hour, just to be sure. "Sir?" Maya's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Will we be facing Grimjaw individually, or as a group?" Her tone was respectful but curious, with absolutely no trace of the terror that should have been coursing through her tiny human veins. Velthok's mandibles clicked in mild annoyance. "Individually, Cadet Cross. The beast needs to evaluate each warrior's personal strength and character." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just wondering about the logistics, sir. Will there be a specific time limit, or should we improvise based on the creature's behavior patterns?" Several of her fellow cadets turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from admiration to outright disbelief. Here they were, contemplating their potential dismemberment, and she was asking about time management. "The trial ends when Grimjaw decides it ends, Cadet. The beast has its own ways of determining worth." Maya nodded again, that same pleasant smile never leaving her face. "Understood, sir. Thank you for the clarification." Velthok suppressed the urge to shake his head. 27 cycles, and he still couldn't figure out humans. The first cadet was Zeph Cole, a towering Carthan warrior whose head crest practically scraped the arena entrance. He strutted into the circular chamber with all the confidence his species was famous for, energy sword humming at his hip and chest plates gleaming in the artificial sunlight. The arena itself was a masterpiece of intimidation. 50 meters in diameter, surrounded by reinforced viewing galleries, with a sandy floor marked by the claw gouges and scorch marks of countless previous trials. At the far end sat a heavy metal gate, behind which something very large and very angry was making very unpleasant noises. "Release Grimjaw," Velthok commanded. The gate rumbled upward with dramatic slowness, revealing the Coalition's most feared training asset. Grimjaw stood 4 meters at the shoulder, possessed 6 legs that ended in claws the size of combat knives, and sported a mouth full of teeth that could probably bite through starship armor. His hide was a mottled dark green that shifted color with his mood, and right now it was displaying the lovely crimson pattern that meant someone is about to become lunch. Zeph Cole drew his weapon and assumed a classic Carthan fighting stance. The war beast studied him for a moment, head tilted like a curious predator, then let out a roar that rattled the viewing gallery windows. What followed was, by Carthan standards, a glorious battle. Zeph Cole fought with skill and courage, dancing around Grimjaw's attacks while landing precise strikes with his energy blade. The war beast, for his part, seemed to be enjoying the challenge. He snapped and clawed and tail-whipped with obvious enthusiasm, never quite managing to catch the agile Carthan but coming close enough to keep things interesting. After 15 minutes of this deadly dance, Grimjaw suddenly stopped. The massive creature settled back on his haunches and let out a rumbling noise that sounded almost like approval. Zeph Cole, breathing heavily but still standing, was officially declared passed. Next, Velthok called. The trials continued with predictable results. The Milvani scout, Tixran, relied on speed and agility, earning a grudging acknowledgement from Grimjaw after demonstrating an impressive series of evasive maneuvers. The Zoran heavy, Grok Tool, simply stood his ground and traded blows with the war beast until mutual respect was established through what could only be described as therapeutic violence. Each species faced the trial in their own way. The insectoid clique cadets swarmed around Grimjaw in coordinated patterns. The crystalline shards used defensive formations that turned them into living shields. The aquatic depths, struggling with the dry environment, nonetheless showed remarkable tactical creativity. And through it all, Maya Cross watched with rapt attention, occasionally making small notes in a standard-issue datapad. Taking notes on monster fighting techniques, Cadet Cross? Velthok asked during a brief break between trials. Oh yes, sir. Grimjaw's behavior patterns are fascinating. He's not just testing combat ability, is he? He's evaluating character traits, stress responses, adaptability under pressure. It's really quite sophisticated. You seem remarkably calm about facing a creature that could eat you in 3 bites. Maya looked up from her notes with that same bright smile. Well, sir, statistical analysis of the previous trials suggests that Grimjaw has no actual intention of causing permanent harm to cadets. His attack patterns consistently avoid lethal strikes, and he demonstrates clear recognition signals when satisfied with a cadet's performance. Really, he's more like a very large, very intimidating psychology professor than an actual war beast. Velthok stared at her with all 4 eye stalks. In 27 cycles of military service, he had never heard anyone describe Grimjaw as a psychology professor. Accurate, perhaps, but definitely not the first analogy that came to mind when facing down 6 legs of pure predatory terror. That's an interesting perspective, Cadet Cross. Thank you, sir. I find that most situations become less stressful when you understand the underlying behavioral mechanics. Before Velthok could formulate a response to that particular piece of human logic, the current trial ended. Cadet Vormishk, a slug-like Gelen, had successfully demonstrated his species' remarkable defensive capabilities by essentially becoming a living boulder until Grimjaw got bored and wandered away. Unconventional, but effective. Cadet Cross, Velthok announced. You're up. Maya tucked her datapad away and walked toward the arena entrance with the same casual confidence she might display while heading to the cafeteria. Her fellow cadets watched in fascination and horror as the tiny human disappeared through the doorway. Inside the arena, Maya took a moment to survey her surroundings. The sandy floor, the claw marks, the scorch patterns from energy weapons, the faint smell of ozone and predator musk. She nodded to herself, apparently satisfied with her observations, then looked up at the closed gate where Grimjaw waited. Release Grimjaw, came the command from above. The gate began its dramatic ascent, revealing the massive war beast in all his terrifying glory. Grimjaw stepped into the arena with deliberate menace, his hide already shifting to those lovely warning colors that meant business was about to commence. He saw the small human standing in the center of the arena and paused, his massive head tilted to one side, then the other, as if trying to process what he was looking at. Where was the weapon? Where was the defensive posture? Where was the obvious terror that should have been radiating from this tiny, fragile creature? Maya, meanwhile, was studying Grimjaw with the same intense curiosity she had shown during the previous trials. She took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between herself and several tons of genetically enhanced predator. Hello there, she said in a conversational tone. You must be Grimjaw. I'm Maya. I've been looking forward to meeting you. The war beast's head tilted further. In 20 cycles of arena trials, no cadet had ever walked toward him while making polite introductions. Most of them were too busy running, fighting, or occasionally fainting to engage in social pleasantries. Maya took another step forward, now well within Grimjaw's striking range. The creature's massive head lowered until they were nearly eye to eye, and Maya smiled that same bright, innocent smile she had been wearing all day. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been watching your previous trials, and I have to say, you're remarkably good at what you do. The way you adapted your testing approach for each species showed really impressive psychological insight. The Carthans needed a warrior's challenge, so you gave them honorable combat. The Milvani needed to prove their agility, so you tested their evasive capabilities. Each trial was perfectly calibrated to bring out the best in each cadet." Grimjaw's eyes, each the size of dinner plates, focused on the small human with growing confusion. This was definitely not standard cadet behavior. "But here's what I find really interesting," Maya continued, taking yet another step closer. "You're not actually a war beast at all, are you? Oh, certainly you're large and intimidating, and could probably demolish a small building if you put your mind to it. But your actual function here is educational. You're a teacher." The massive creature made a sound that was part growl, part whimper, and entirely baffled. Maya reached up with one small hand and gently touched the side of his enormous muzzle. "It must be lonely sometimes," she said softly. "Being seen as a monster when you're actually trying to help people become better warriors. Never getting credit for the careful way you design each trial, the thought you put into bringing out each cadet's potential. Always being called a beast when you're clearly one of the most intelligent creatures on this base." In the viewing gallery, Velthok's mandibles had gone completely slack. 27 cycles of military service, and he was watching a tiny human give psychological counseling to their most feared training asset. Grimjaw, meanwhile, was experiencing something very close to an emotional crisis. The small human's words were resonating with feelings he had never quite been able to articulate. He was proud of his work, damn it. He did put careful thought into each trial. And yes, it was lonely being treated like a simple-minded beast when he possessed intelligence that rivaled most sentient species. Maya seemed to sense his internal struggle. She continued stroking his massive muzzle with gentle, soothing movements. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think you're tired of pretending to be something you're not. Tired of playing the role of the scary monster when what you really want is for someone to recognize the sophisticated educator you actually are." Grimjaw's throat rumbled. But it wasn't a growl. It was something much deeper, much more vulnerable. His massive head drooped slightly until his forehead was nearly touching Maya's shoulder. "There we go," Maya murmured, now using both hands to stroke his scales. "It's okay. You don't have to be the war beast right now. You can just be you." And that's when something unprecedented happened in the arena of trials. Grimjaw, the feared war beast who had tested thousands of cadets across dozens of cycles, slowly and deliberately lowered himself to the sandy floor. His massive form settled with surprising grace until he was lying down, his great head resting on his front paws. Maya smiled and sat down beside him, one small hand continuing its gentle stroking motion along his neck scales. "That's much better, isn't it?" she said. "Sometimes we all need someone to see us for who we really are, rather than who we're supposed to be." In the viewing gallery, complete silence reigned. Cadets from 17 different species stared in shock at the scene below. The mighty Grimjaw, terror of the training grounds, was receiving what appeared to be therapeutic, emotional support from a human who barely reached his nostril height. Velthok activated the arena communication system with shaking appendages. "Cadet Cross." His voice echoed across the arena. What are you doing?" Maya looked up at the gallery with that same innocent smile. "Passing the trial, sir. Isn't that obvious? But he hasn't tested your combat abilities, your courage under fire, your warrior spirit." "Oh, but he has," Maya replied. "The test was never about fighting, was it? It was about understanding, about recognizing what kind of warrior each cadet could become. Some needed to prove their strength, others their speed or cleverness. But what did I need to prove?" She gestured to Grimjaw, who was now making a sound remarkably similar to purring. "I needed to prove that humans can see past the surface to recognize the person underneath. that we can offer compassion even to those who are supposed to be our enemies, that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in how hard you can fight, but in how well you can understand. Grimjaw lifted his massive head and looked directly at the viewing gallery. His eyes, for perhaps the first time in decades, held something other than predatory calculation. They held gratitude. He opened his enormous mouth and let out a sound that no cadet had ever heard before. It started as a roar, but modulated into something almost musical, almost happy. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come, Grimjaw lowered his head until his forehead touched Maya's in what could only be described as a bow of respect. The trial was over. Maya Cross had passed in the most unconventional way possible. As she stood and brushed sand from her uniform, she gave Grimjaw one final pat on his massive snout. "Thank you for the lesson," she said quietly. "I learned a lot today." Grimjaw rumbled something that sounded remarkably like, "You're welcome," and watched as she walked toward the arena exit. In the viewing gallery, Velthok was having what could charitably be described as an existential crisis. In 27 cycles of military service, he had never seen anything like what had just occurred. The tiny human had not only passed the trial, she had somehow managed to give their war beast what appeared to be the first genuinely positive social interaction he had experienced in decades. As Maya emerged from the arena, her fellow cadets stared at her with expressions ranging from awe to complete bewilderment. She had just done something that would have been considered impossible by every tactical manual in the Coalition database. "How?" Zeph Cole asked, his head crest drooping with confusion. "How did you know?" Maya considered the question seriously. "Well, it was mostly observation and basic psychological principles." Grimjaw's behavior patterns suggested high intelligence and possible social isolation. His testing methods demonstrated genuine concern for cadet development rather than simple aggression, and his body language during the trials showed signs of someone performing a role rather than acting on instinct. She paused, then added with that innocent smile, "Plus, he had the loneliest eyes I've ever seen. Sometimes that's all you need to know about someone." Velthok approached the group, his 4 eye stalks weaving in obvious distress. "Cadet Cross," he began, then stopped. What exactly did one say to someone who had just revolutionized decades of military training doctrine by giving emotional therapy to a war beast? "Sir?" Maya responded politely. That was not what I expected from today's trials." "No, sir, I imagine it wasn't. But sometimes the most important lessons are the ones we don't expect to learn." As if on cue, a deep, resonant call echoed from the arena. Grimjaw was singing. Actually singing, in harmonics that no one had known he possessed. "What happens now?" Velthok asked, more to himself than to anyone else. Maya tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, sir, I suspect Grimjaw might benefit from some actual social interaction, perhaps regularly scheduled visits from cadets who have passed their trials, and maybe someone should consider reviewing his living conditions. Isolation is psychologically damaging for intelligent social creatures." She looked back toward the arena, where the singing continued. "Also, sir, I think you might want to consider revising the official designation. War beast seems rather insulting for someone of his obvious intelligence and emotional sophistication. Perhaps training supervisor would be more appropriate?" Velthok's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sure sign of cognitive overload. "Training supervisor," he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir. It has a much nicer ring to it, don't you think?" And with that cheerful observation, Maya Cross, the tiny human who had just redefined everything they thought they knew about courage, strength, and the nature of true warriorship, gathered up her notes and headed toward the exit. Behind her, Grimjaw's song continued to echo across the training grounds, a sound of joy that no one had expected to hear but everyone would remember for the rest of their lives. The trial was over, but the real education had just begun. 3 weeks had passed since what the Academy now referred to as the incident. Word had spread throughout the Galactic Defense Coalition faster than a quantum transmission, carrying with it a mixture of disbelief, fascination, and bureaucratic panic. High Command was not particularly fond of having their established training protocols revolutionized by a cadet who looked like she should be serving tea at diplomatic functions rather than rewriting military doctrine. Admiral Keth Vor, Supreme Commander of Coalition Forces, stood before the massive viewing screen in his flagship's war room, reviewing the arena footage for the 17th time. His scaled hide rippled with colors that indicated severe mental distress, while his 6 primary advisors maintained the kind of respectful silence that suggested they were all secretly wondering if their boss had finally snapped under the pressure of command. "Play it again," he commanded in a voice that could have flash-frozen a solar flare. "Sir," ventured his chief tactical officer, a spindly Vex named Knelt. "Perhaps we should discuss the implications rather than play it again." The screen flickered to life, showing Maya Cross walking calmly towards several tons of genetically enhanced predator while making polite conversation. Admiral Kethvor's throat sacs inflated and deflated in rapid succession, a sure sign that his blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. 23 years, he muttered. 23 years of perfect trial protocols. Thousands of cadets tested. 0 major incidents. And then this. This tiny human shows up and turns our most reliable training asset into a therapeutic counseling patient. "Sir," Knelt tried again, "the psychological evaluation reports are quite fascinating. It appears that Grimjaw has been experiencing something analogous to clinical depression for several cycles. The human female's intervention may have actually. I don't care if she cured him of existential angst and taught him to knit sweaters." Admiral Kethvor's bellow echoed through the war room. "She has completely disrupted our entire training paradigm." Meanwhile, back on the academy training grounds, Maya Cross was experiencing her own set of complications. Her fellow cadets had developed an alarming tendency to stare at her with expressions ranging from hero worship to scientific curiosity. Conversations tended to stop when she entered a room, and she had noticed that several cadets were taking notes whenever she did anything remotely noteworthy, which apparently included eating lunch and tying her bootlaces. "It's getting a bit ridiculous," she confided to her bunkmate, Zara Voss, a practical-minded engineer from the Terran colonies. "Yesterday I sneezed, and 3 cadets asked if that was some kind of advanced human combat technique." Zara, who possessed the kind of dry wit that came from years of dealing with malfunctioning life support systems, raised an eyebrow. "Well, is it?" "Zara, I'm just saying, at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if you told me humans had weaponized their respiratory reflexes." Maya was spared from having to respond to this particular observation by the arrival of Commander Velthok, who still looked like he was suffering from mild shell shock every time he encountered her. His 4 eye stalks swiveled in different directions before focusing on her with obvious effort. "Cadet Cross," he began, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying very hard not to accidentally trigger another paradigm shift. "You have been requested to report to the advanced training facility. There has been a development." Maya gathered her gear with the same efficient calm she brought to everything else. "What kind of development, sir?" "The kind that involves high command, a panel of xenopsychologists, and approximately 17 different species of military brass who are all very interested in meeting the human who gave emotional therapy to a war beast." Velthok paused, then added with what might have been the first genuine smile Maya had seen from him, "Also, Grimjaw has been asking for you. Specifically, by name, which is both unprecedented and slightly terrifying from a bureaucratic standpoint." The advanced training facility was located in the Academy's most secure section, behind enough security checkpoints to protect a small moon. Maya found herself being escorted through corridors lined with enough brass to start their own mining operation. Representatives from dozens of coalition species stood in small clusters, speaking in the hushed tones typically reserved for discussions of galactic significance or particularly explosive ordnance. At the center of all this attention sat Grimjaw himself, in what appeared to be a specially constructed meeting room that could accommodate his massive frame. He was surrounded by xenopsychologists with their various scanning devices, behavioral analysts with their clipboards, and a handful of very nervous-looking military officials who seemed to be questioning their life choices. The moment Maya entered the room, Grimjaw's massive head turned toward her with obvious pleasure. His hide shifted to colors that the assembled scientists immediately began documenting with excited whispers. "Hello, Grimjaw," Maya said warmly, approaching him with the same fearless calm she had shown in the arena. "How are you feeling today?" The massive creature rumbled what sounded remarkably like contentment. and lowered his head so Maya could reach his favorite spot behind his left ear ridge. Several scientists nearly dropped their equipment in their haste to record this interaction. "Much better now that you're here, Maya Cross," Grimjaw replied, his voice a deep bass that resonated through the floor. The silence that followed this statement was so profound that Maya could hear the quiet hum of the ventilation systems. She looked around the room at the frozen expressions of shock and slowly raised one eyebrow. "He's been able to speak this entire time, hasn't he?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. Dr. Yeth Mole, the Academy's chief xenopsychologist, cleared his throat with obvious embarrassment. "Well, yes. Grimjaw possesses full linguistic capabilities in 17 coalition languages, plus several ancient dialects that predate most of our historical records. We simply never thought to ask him to participate in conversations." Maya's expression shifted to something that could charitably be described as pointed disapproval. "You never thought to ask a clearly intelligent being to participate in conversations. He was classified as a training asset," one of the military officials interjected defensively. "His role was to test cadets, not to engage in social discourse." "His role," Maya said with the kind of dangerously quiet tone that made seasoned commanders nervous, "was whatever you decided it should be, without ever consulting him about his preferences or capabilities." Grimjaw lifted his massive head and looked directly at the assembled officials. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made it clear exactly how intelligent he actually was. "For 43 cycles," he said slowly, "I have performed the function assigned to me. I have tested cadets, evaluated their potential, and provided the challenges necessary for their development. I have done this work with dedication and precision, despite the fact that no one ever bothered to acknowledge my contributions or ask for my input on how the trials might be improved." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I have watched thousands of young warriors grow and develop, knowing that my efforts help shape them into the defenders our galaxy needs. And I have done all of this while being treated as little more than a sophisticated piece of equipment." The room remained absolutely silent. Several of the officials had developed the uncomfortable expressions of people who were beginning to realize they might have made some significant ethical oversights. "Until 3 weeks ago," Grimjaw continued, his massive eyes focusing on Maya with obvious affection, "when this remarkable young human looked at me and saw not a training tool, but a person, someone worthy of respect, understanding, and simple courtesy." Maya reached up to pat his snout gently. "Everyone deserves to be seen for who they are, Grimjaw. That's not remarkable, that's just basic decency. And that," Admiral Kethvor's voice cut through the room like a plasma cutter, "is exactly why we have a problem." The Admiral had entered without fanfare, his scaled hide displaying the deep purples and blacks that indicated serious displeasure. He moved through the assembled crowd with the kind of presence that suggested he could probably conquer small planets as a hobby. "Cadet Cross," he said, his voice carrying enough authority to rearrange furniture. "You have managed to single-handedly disrupt 43 cycles of established protocol, create a galactic incident that has reached the highest levels of coalition command, and force us to completely reevaluate our treatment of what we now discover is not a training asset but a sentient being with rights under coalition law." Maya straightened to attention, but her expression remained calm. "Yes, sir. I can see how that would be disruptive." "Disruptive?" Admiral Kethvor's throat sacs inflated to approximately twice their normal size. "Cadet, you have turned our entire military training system upside down. We have xenopsychologists demanding investigations into the ethical treatment of all military support creatures. We have coalition representatives calling for reviews of our personnel classification protocols. And we have 17 different news networks wanting to interview the human who liberated a war beast through the power of emotional validation." He paused, his colors shifting to something that might have been grudging respect. "What exactly do you have to say for yourself?" Maya considered the question seriously, then looked around the room at the assembled officials, scientists, and advisors. "I suppose I would say that if treating someone with basic dignity and respect causes this much disruption to established systems, then maybe those systems needed to be disrupted." The silence that followed this statement was broken by what sounded suspiciously like applause. It was coming from Grimjaw, who was slowly bringing his massive front paws together in a gesture of approval. "Well said, Maya Cross," he rumbled. Well said indeed. Admiral Keth Vor stared at the scene before him, his colors cycling through the entire spectrum of command-level frustration. Finally, he seemed to reach some kind of internal decision. "Dr. Yethmol," he said sharply, "I want a full review of all military support creatures. If we have been unknowingly mistreating sentient beings, I want to know about it. Commander Vel Thok, you will work with Grimjaw to redesign the trial protocols. Apparently we have been doing this wrong for 43 cycles." He turned back to Maya, his expression unreadable. "As for you, Cadet Cross, you present us with a unique problem. Your actions were technically insubordinate, as you completely ignored established trial procedures. However, your results suggest capabilities that could be extremely valuable to Coalition forces." Maya waited quietly for him to continue. "Therefore," Admiral Keth Vor announced, "you are hereby transferred to the Advanced Strategic Studies program, where your particular talents can be properly developed. You will also serve as official liaison between Command and our newly reclassified training supervisor." Grimjaw rumbled with obvious pleasure. "I would very much enjoy working with Maya Cross on a regular basis. She has excellent insights into behavioral psychology." "I'm sure she does," the Admiral replied dryly. "Which brings me to my final point. Cadet Cross, your human tendency to see potential where others see problems is apparently both your greatest strength and your most dangerous characteristic. I want you to remember that not every situation can be resolved through compassion and understanding." Maya nodded respectfully. "Of course not, sir. Sometimes you need tactical brilliance, strategic thinking, technological innovation, or plain old-fashioned stubbornness. But I've found that understanding usually helps with all of those other approaches. And sometimes," Admiral Keth Vor said with the kind of smile that suggested he had finally figured out what to do with this particular human, "you need someone who can look at an impossible situation and find the one solution nobody else considered." 3 months later, Maya Cross stood in the redesigned training facility, watching as the latest group of cadets prepared for their trials. The arena had been expanded and modified, with comfortable observation areas and social spaces where cadets could interact with Grimjaw before and after their tests. The trials themselves had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple combat challenges. Working together, Maya and Grimjaw had developed a system that evaluated not just warrior capability, but leadership potential, creative problem-solving, and the kind of character traits that would serve the Coalition in an increasingly complex galaxy. Next group, called Training Supervisor Grimjaw, his official title now properly reflecting his role and status. His voice carried warmth and encouragement rather than intimidation. Maya watched as a nervous group of new cadets entered the arena, their expressions showing the usual mixture of excitement and terror. But now they also carried something else: the knowledge that they were about to be evaluated by one of the Coalition's most respected training experts, someone whose insights would help them become the best warriors they could be. "Remember," she called out to them, "this isn't about proving you're fearless. It's about proving you can think, adapt, and work with others to overcome challenges. Training Supervisor Grimjaw is here to help you discover your potential, not to simply test your survival instincts." One of the cadets, a young Carthan who looked barely old enough to tie his own combat boots, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what if we're not strong enough? What if we're not brave enough?" Maya smiled, the same bright, encouraging smile that had first confused Commander Vel Thok all those months ago. "Then Training Supervisor Grimjaw will help you find the strength and courage you didn't know you had. That's what good teachers do. They don't just test what you already know, they help you become more than you thought possible." Grimjaw rumbled his agreement. "Maya Cross speaks wisdom, young warriors. The greatest victory is not defeating an enemy, but discovering the hero within yourself." As the trials began, Maya reflected on how much had changed since that day when she had first walked into the arena. The Coalition's approach to training had been revolutionized, their treatment of intelligence support staff had been completely reformed, and their understanding of what made an effective warrior had been expanded far beyond simple combat prowess. But perhaps most importantly, she had helped prove something that humans had always suspected but rarely had the chance to demonstrate on a galactic stage: that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in how hard you could fight, but in how well you could understand, communicate, and connect with others. Even if those others happened to be 6-legged, 4-meter tall, genetically enhanced predators with psychological counseling needs. In the arena, the latest group of cadets was discovering their potential with the help of the galaxy's most unconventional training team. And somewhere in the administrative offices, Admiral Keth Vor was updating the Coalition's official records to reflect the fact that their most effective training innovation had come from a tiny human who believed in the radical concept of treating everyone with dignity and respect. The war beast had become a teacher, the teacher had become a friend, and the friend had helped reshape the future of military training across the galaxy. And Maya Cross, the human who had started it all, continued to smile, that innocent, determined smile that suggested she was already working on her next impossible solution to an unthinkable problem. After all, that's what humans did best.